Imagine waking up one frigid morning in your Finnish apartment, expecting the steady hum of radiators, the glow of streetlights, and the familiar whir of coffee machines. Instead, you are greeted by silence, darkness, and a creeping chill, not the result of a freak blizzard or a random technical glitch, but the deliberate action of a government hundreds of miles to the east. The everyday normalcy of energy, something you took for granted your entire life, has vanished with a single, calculated command. For more than 5 decades, the electric bond between Russia and Finland was a silent pillar of stability. Through the ebb and flow of wars, the icy tension of the Cold War, and the roller coaster of global economic crises, Russian energy kept Finnish lights burning and homes heated. Families in Helsinki, Oulu, and Rovaniemi grew up trusting that, regardless of political headlines or financial storms, the power would always flow. Elderly Finns recall winters when the snow piled high and the wind howled down from the Arctic. Yet their apartments stayed warm thanks to the invisible lifeline stretching across the border. Yet in a single moment, that lifeline was cut, plunging an entire nation into uncertainty. Russia, once a steadfast supplier, abruptly halted all electricity exports to Finland. The decision came not at the end of lengthy public debate, but as a sudden, quiet command, one that erased decades of cooperation with the flick of a switch. The stability upon which millions relied proved more fragile than anyone dared admit. This was no mere technical hiccup. Finnish officials, energy sector analysts, and global observers agree. The blackout was an intentional maneuver, crafted as a response to mounting diplomatic and economic frictions between Moscow and Helsinki. In the days and weeks leading up to the cutoff, subtle threats and warnings had circulated, but few believed it would come to this. When the order finally came, millions of Finnish citizens found themselves subjected to rolling blackouts. As the northern nights grew longer and colder, heating systems coughed and stalled, and entire neighborhoods slipped into darkness. The once invisible infrastructure that powered everything from city subways to rural farms had been exposed as vulnerable to distant decisions and geopolitical gamesmanship. What does this tell us about the safety of our own routines? If a partnership built painstakingly over half a century can be undone overnight, how secure are the systems we depend on every day? The jobs we work for, the comforts we enjoy, the stability we assume permanent, can all be swept away by forces beyond our immediate control. The story of Finland's blackout is not just about two nations, but about the universal fragility of trust in a world where political tides can turn in an instant. How did such a deep partnership unravel so suddenly? What sequence of events led two neighbors from mutual reliance to suspicion and isolation, all in the space of a single night? To answer these questions, we need to trace the roots of the Russian-Finnish energy bond and examine the fault lines that ultimately caused it to snap. The origins of this partnership date back to the late 1960s, when the world was split by the ideological divide of the Cold War. While superpowers postured and deployed armies, something quieter was happening along the border of Finland and the Soviet Union: the construction of cross-border power lines. Soviet engineers, working in tandem with Finnish planners, designed and built infrastructure that would allow electricity to flow northward. The project was seen as an emblem of pragmatism, a recognition that, even in a divided world, mutual benefit could overcome suspicion. Throughout the 70s and 80s, as the Iron Curtain cast its shadow over Europe, the energy connection deepened. When the global oil crisis of the 1970s sent shockwaves through economies from New York to Tokyo, Finnish factories kept running. Why? Because Russian electricity cushioned the worst effects. When the Soviet Union itself teetered on the brink of collapse in the late 1980s and early 90s, the flow of power did not stop. Even as the ruble crashed and governments changed, Russian energy continued to be pumped into Finland, providing an anchor of reliability amid chaos. By the turn of the millennium, the energy relationship had become deeply institutionalized. On some years, Russian imports accounted for as much as 1/5 of Finland's total electricity consumption. That is the equivalent of every fifth light bulb, every fifth computer, every fifth train, powered by Russian generators. For comparison, imagine if 1/5 of the water in New York City's taps came from a single reservoir in another country. The dependence was profound, but so was the trust, at least on the surface. The partnership was more than just business. It became entwined with national identity and security. For Finland, Russian electricity was a shield against the volatility of global energy markets. It ensured that factories could fulfill orders even in the dead of winter, that hospitals could operate during power surges, and that millions of homes would not go cold. For Russia, Finland was a model customer, a gateway to European markets and proof that even adversaries could find common ground through commerce. But as with many long-standing relationships, the seeds of future conflict were quietly sown amid the rituals of trust. As the 21st century unfolded, Finland's strategic outlook began to shift. The European Union expanded, creating a vast new market for energy and opening the door to alternative sources. Finnish policymakers, watching the increasing unpredictability of Russian foreign policy, began to question the wisdom of relying so heavily on a single supplier. Historical parallels abound. In the 1970s, Western Europe experienced the OPEC oil embargo, a stark lesson in what can happen when political disputes disrupt energy supplies. Countries like Germany and France responded by building strategic reserves, investing in nuclear power, and developing more complex supply chains. For a time, Finland seemed insulated from such shocks, but the memory of those disruptions lingered in the minds of energy planners. By the late 2000s, Finland was investing heavily in renewable energy, expanding connections to the Nordic power grid, and exploring options for nuclear generation. Yet, the old habits persisted. Russian electricity, with its competitive prices and reliable delivery, continued to flow. Contracts were renegotiated, tariffs were debated, but the basic structure endured. It was only when the geopolitical climate began to sour, amid disputes over border security, trade policy, and military alliances, that the cracks began to widen. Negotiations over electricity supply became increasingly fraught. Finland pushed for flexible, short-term contracts that would allow it to take advantage of market fluctuations and hedge against political risk. Russia, clinging to the traditions of long-term agreements, viewed such demands as a threat to stability and mutual respect. The two sides found themselves speaking past each other, each interpreting the other's actions through the lens of growing suspicion. For more than 5 years, behind-the-scenes talks grew colder. Finnish officials publicly announced their intention to reduce dependence on Russian energy, aligning themselves more closely with European partners. Russian officials, meanwhile, accused Helsinki of ingratitude and warned that such moves would have consequences. The rhetoric escalated. Technical disputes over tariffs and volumes became entangled with broader questions of sovereignty and national pride. The situation became more tense when Finland made clear its ambitions for full energy independence. From Moscow's perspective, this was not merely a business decision, but a symbolic rejection of decades of partnership. The final round of talks collapsed, with both sides blaming the other for intransigence. Russian patience, as some insiders put it, had simply run out. Yet, the actual cutoff came as a shock. On a quiet evening, as most Finns prepared for bed, control rooms in Russia executed the order to halt all exports. Within minutes, automated systems on the Finnish side detected the loss of supply and triggered emergency protocols. Regional grids in northern and eastern Finland were switched to internal reserves, but these measures could only compensate for a fraction of the lost power. Social media platforms lit up with images and videos. Entire blocks plunged into darkness, families lighting candles and wearing winter coats indoors, small children peering out windows at the eerie, unlit streets. The impact was not limited to homes. Major factories reported production halts worth millions of euros per day. Airports and train stations announced delays, with some shutting down entirely due to lack of power for critical systems. Hospitals switched to backup generators and postponed non-emergency procedures. The economic consequences were immediate. The price of electricity on the Nordic Power Exchange soared by more than double within hours. Small businesses, already struggling from global supply chain disruptions, faced the prospect of bankruptcy as their energy bills spiked and customers stayed home. For heavy industry, the choices were stark: reduce output, risk equipment damage, or shut down entirely to avoid catastrophic losses. As the crisis deepened, the Finnish government issued appeals for calm and rationing. Citizens were urged to limit energy use, avoid unnecessary travel, and prepare for possible longer outages. In rural areas, some communities reverted to wood stoves and manual water pumps, a reminder of a way of life thought to be relegated to history. Emergency services set up warming centers for the elderly and vulnerable, while volunteers distributed blankets and food. International response was swift but limited. Sweden and Norway, Finland's Nordic neighbors, pledged support, but technical and logistical hurdles meant that cross-border flows could only partially offset the loss. The European Union issued statements of solidarity and offered to coordinate assistance, but energy experts warned that the complexity of the grid and the scale of the shortfall made quick fixes impossible. Historical echoes came to mind for many observers. The oil crises of the past, the California electricity crisis of the early 2000s, and the more recent energy shortages in Texas during the winter storm of 2021, all served as reminders that no modern system is immune to sudden disruption. In each case, the immediate impacts were compounded by the realization that underlying vulnerabilities had been ignored for too long. Amid the mounting uncertainty, Finnish society displayed remarkable resilience. Community groups organized mutual aid networks, sharing generators and pooling resources. Local governments accelerated plans for renewable energy installations, fast-tracked grid upgrades, and revisited contingency protocols. Schools incorporated lessons on energy security and resilience into their curricula, teaching the next generation the importance of preparedness. Yet, the scars of the blackout lingered. Businesses tallied their losses, governments reassessed their strategies, and families reconsidered their assumptions about what could be counted on. The psychological impact was profound: a sense of collective vulnerability, a loss of innocence, and a renewed appreciation for the invisible systems that sustain modern life. What lessons can we draw from Finland's experience, and how can we apply them to our own lives and societies? The answers are as relevant to individuals as they are to nations. First, diversity is not just a buzzword, it is a necessity. Relying on a single source of supply, whether for energy, food, or other essentials, invites disaster. History is replete with examples: the Irish potato famine of the 19th century, the oil shocks of the 20th century, the semiconductor shortages of the 21st century. In every case, a lack of alternatives turned manageable problems into full-blown crises. For nations, this means investing in a mix of energy sources: renewables like wind and solar, nuclear power, hydroelectricity, and strategic reserves. It means building interconnections with multiple neighbors and developing the technical capacity to switch suppliers quickly. For businesses, it means diversifying supply chains, maintaining contingency inventories, and investing in digital systems that can adapt to changing circumstances. For households, it means having backup plans, generators, stored food, alternative heating sources, and a culture of readiness. Second, technical systems are inseparable from the political environment in which they operate. Decisions made in parliaments, boardrooms, or distant capitals can have cascading effects on ordinary lives. The case of Finland shows how sanctions, diplomatic disputes, or even sharp rhetoric can trigger disruptions that no engineer could have foreseen. The lesson is clear: technical resilience must be matched by diplomatic and strategic foresight. Third, the twin dangers of overdependence and abrupt isolation must be managed with care. Lean too heavily on a single partner, and you lose bargaining power and flexibility. Cut ties without preparation, and you risk chaos, blackouts, economic shocks, and social upheaval. The optimal path is balance, maintaining enough independence to withstand shocks, but enough connection to benefit from cooperation. Practical steps abound, drawn from historical and contemporary examples. After the 1970s oil crisis, Japan invested massively in energy efficiency and alternative sources, reducing its vulnerability to external shocks. In the wake of the California energy crisis, new regulations and market reforms were enacted to prevent manipulation and ensure stability. When Texas faced catastrophic blackouts, communities and authorities reevaluated grid design, weatherization standards, and emergency planning. Finland itself, post-crisis, accelerated the deployment of smart grids, battery storage, and cross-border energy agreements. On the individual level, preparedness is not paranoia, it is prudence. Keep a flashlight and extra batteries in your home. Store enough food and water for several days. Learn how to operate your heating system manually. Build networks with neighbors, so that help is available when the unexpected strikes. These are simple, time-tested measures that can make the difference between hardship and resilience. But perhaps the most important lesson is psychological. Routine breeds complacency, and complacency is the enemy of resilience. The systems we trust, whether power grids, the internet, or the institutions that govern us, are only as strong as the weakest link. The moment we stop questioning, stop planning, stop preparing, is the moment we become vulnerable to shocks that history tells us will come, sooner or later. Why did so many fail to heed the warning signs? The answer lies in the seductive comfort of the status quo. When things work, day after day, year after year, it is easy to believe they always will. The human mind is wired to forget past disruptions and discount future risks. Yet time and again, history reminds us that stability is an active achievement, not a passive inheritance. Energy, security, and trust are invisible threads that bind societies together. When one snaps, the unraveling can be swift and merciless. The Finnish blackout is a case study not just of technical failure or diplomatic miscalculation, but of the broader human tendency to take the essential for granted. So, as you reflect on this story, ask yourself, what systems do you rely on? Where does your power, literal or metaphorical, come from? Who controls the switches, and what would happen if they were flipped off tomorrow? The answers are not always comfortable, but they are necessary. Whether you are a national leader or an ordinary citizen, the imperative is the same. Build resilience, diversify your dependencies, and never confuse comfort with security. Because the next crisis may not wait for you to be ready, and when it comes, preparation will be the only defense against the darkness. In the end, Finland's blackout is more than a regional drama. It is a wake-up call to the world. The invisible systems that sustain us are only as strong as our willingness to plan, adapt, and stay vigilant. Ignore the lesson, and you may find yourself, like millions of Finns, stumbling through the dark, wondering how it all went dark so fast.